Hi everyone, welcome you all back to the Learn Sustainability channel. And then today's session will look at how to buy responsibly and take into consideration those three aspects, which is economic, social, and environmental, which are also referred as the three pillars of sustainability while purchasing a product. So let's see how we can buy more responsibly. So I'm just taking an example of buying a pot and see how that can be considered and how the three aspects of social, environmental, and economic aspect be considered. Now we have the supply chain. It's more from an upstream supply chain perspective, where we have the raw material, and the raw material moves to a supplier, and from the supplier it actually moves to the factory, and factory consumes some level of electricity or natural gas which comes from the utility company. And we have the transport across the different sections, so we have emissions coming up from all these factories and suppliers and raw materials, and we also have emissions coming up from transportation before it actually reaches our house. Now this can change based on how you buy, where you buy, but yes, this is the overall impact of buying a product. And not to forget the downstream process, which may include recycling and reprocessing, which also impacts our total emissions. So once you buy a product, you can see the amount of emissions that comes across the whole supply chain, and maybe we can consider that aspect when buying, and how important or significant buying actually is. Now from the economic perspective, you can see those dollar amounts that are coming up, and you actually see cost being included in each of those processes. So we actually are getting something paid to each of these processes. Now the dollar in each of these sectors is basically the cost of product or services plus profit or loss. So you can see that each one wants to make the profit, and profit is important and necessary. Economic is one of the key pillars of sustainability, so we need to consider that aspect. Only thing is, too much is probably too bad. But the key point that I wanted to bring out was the emission aspect of it, and you can see the amount of emissions that come across. Now the electricity company doesn't generate just like that. It's because there's a demand that is created, and the demand actually creates that emission. So we need to consider this overall picture when we're actually buying, that's the amount of emissions that we create while buying. So from a social perspective, you can see there's a large number of jobs that may be generated across the sectors. Now for let's say a developing country where poverty is a big issue, creating those jobs may become very important, and provided it is able to pull them up from poverty and get them to at least having the basic requirement like house, food and water, and maybe to some level some amenities such as a vehicle for transport and so on. So as long as it's up till there, I think it's fine, but once you start looking at more profits, that's where the issue comes. And everybody is okay with the profit as long as we are not creating those artificial demands by asking them to buy more. So if let's say a product is for life, the product life is of let's say 10 years, and we decide, okay, we want to buy something new and start spending amount on buying something new, maybe 3 years, then you're creating that additional emissions, just for the reason that we need to have a better feeling of buying a new product. And you can see how it impacts. So the key aspect that I wanted to bring out was whether there is a need for that particular product, or whether there is something that makes you happy and you just want to have it. So that becomes a very important criteria, whether it's a need or whether it's a good to have. So This picture is basically very powerful because it shows you clearly how much of emissions happen. Now, yeah, you may decide to have a recycled product, and that will actually reduce the total emissions. And provided you're buying it from somebody else or some kind of recycler, so the total emissions may be significantly reduced, because it's just a product which was being used, and you're just going to take that product and use it. So you're just on the use phase of emissions. So from the three aspects, which is the environmental, social, and economic aspect, you can see how it makes an impact. You can see that emissions are created across the whole supply chain. So just not to consider the emissions that come out from the house based on the cooking or gas that is utilized, or the fuel that's being used in the car, but it's more of the overall supply chain which gets created. And as I mentioned, I've just shown the upstream process, but there's also upstream and downstream process where the overall emissions increase. So when there is data showing that emissions are high from electricity or utility companies or transport companies, this buying actually impacts the overall emissions. Now, taking into consideration one of the examples, you can see there's a plastic pot which is blue in color, costs rupees 100 or maybe any kind of currency. And we have the mud pot or the clay pot, which costs about 300 rupees or bucks. Now, it's quite obvious that most of us will be planning to buy the plastic one because of the cost, which is rupees 100. But let's just look at the input and output processes. Now, the plastic is made based on the factories, and as you can just imagine, the supply chain, and post that you actually get the product. And then there's plastics that's probably dumped or recycled and finally reaches the disposal area, which is shown in the picture. So we have created emissions across this whole supply chain, but also created jobs and many of these processes. The purpose is basically to grow a plant, and what you can see is that the quality of whether it's a plastic or a mud pot may differ. Personally, I like the mud pot because it's more better, and I feel the plants love the mud pot because there's more qualities in the mud pot. And I think those who have already experienced using both may understand that the mud pot is more better for the plants. But as you can see, the mud pot or the clay pot, at least in India, is basically made by a person, and they have this the wheel kind of system where they rotate it and put the clay and then create the pot. Now, there's not much of industries involved in this process, but as you can see, it's a single person who does the pot. I'm sure that there are industries, small scale industries, which are actually manufacturing these kind of pots, but predominantly it's been some person who makes the pot. Now, that person may not be very rich. When I say not very rich, he may be having the basic amenities like a house, water, and food. And this income may actually help him a lot. I'm sure there are people involved in each of those upstream supply chain, but you can see that there is a big economic value if at all we're bringing the person from poverty into some level of comfort. And again, I say I don't see very big comfort. It's very limited comfort in terms of having a house and having enough financial security, and that impacts quite significantly on the social aspect as well. Environmental, there's not much of emissions, at least compared to a plastic pot. You can see that this is manually rotated, and we get the pot. If it is coming from an industry, obviously it's something which you need to consider or think because there are some level of emissions that are coming up. So it might be a good idea to check how the process, how the pot is actually made. And so you can see the economic value may be high, but the social impact is quite high. It's very useful, and emissions wise it's extremely low, and that's a very important point that we need to consider. And of course, to consider those three aspects while actually buying any kind of product. Just think about it. Once the pot is utilized and it's kind of let's say either broken or you plan to replace it, the mud actually goes back into the earth, and there's absolutely not much of waste. You can have plants growing just after that, unlike a plastic which becomes an liability, and it becomes an issue for processing it and creating those emissions, and finally not a good disposal that can happen. So these are the kind of things which we probably need to consider, and I'm sure that many may already be considering these aspects, but it's something which I thought I will share, so that if people are not aware, then they can probably consider these aspects. So from a sustainability perspective, it's very important that we always keep those three pillars in mind, which is the social, environmental, and economic factors before actually buying. As you can see, it has a very big impact in the overall sustainability. So hope this knowledge transfer has been useful, and probably you can start applying it as you buy products or even sometimes services. So hopefully this has been interesting, and hopefully you will consider those aspects while buying the next product or future products.